Hello, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us at Space Cowboy Books Online this evening. I'm your host, Jean-Paul Garnier, and we are here to celebrate Melinda West, Monster Gunslinger by KC Grifant, a wonderful and super fun Weird West book. KC Grifant is a Southern California author who writes internationally published horror, fantasy, science fiction, and Weird West stories for podcast anthologies and magazines. Her writings have appeared in Andromeda Spaceways, Unnerving Magazine, Cosmic Horror Monthly, Tales to Terrify, the Lovecraft E-Zine, Siren's Call publication, and many others. She's also contributed to dozens of anthologies. A member of SIFWA, and a co-founder of San Diego HWA chapter, she enjoys chasing a wild toddler and wandering through beachside carnivals. I'm going to hand it over to KC to read us an excerpt from Melinda West, Monster Gunslinger.
Thank you for that intro, and thanks for having me on. I'm really excited to be here, and thank you for those tuning in and those who will watch later on YouTube. So I'll be reading from Melinda West, Monster Gunslinger, which is a dark fantasy horror adventure set in the Old West. The story takes place in an alternate history where monsters poured into the region, and Bonnie and Clyde-like duo roam the land to offer their exterminating services. But when this couple, Melinda and Lance, accidentally release a demon that steals souls, they find themselves caught in a supernatural war. So I'm going to be reading part of the first chapter and then the interview questions. Melinda never missed, not in her 29 years on this earth. But then again, she never dealt with giant flying scorpions before. She aimed at the two shapes above a cactus several hundred feet away, fired, and watched as one of the bodies dropped. Aside from being bigger than any insect on this earth ought to be, the scorpion's six back legs were webbed, giving them the oh-so-handy ability to become airborne. A calf-sized one flew through the air with its green-tipped tail poised directly toward her head. She slid behind a toppled boulder, dust whipping up and stinging her eyes as the scorpion soared past, pincers outstretched. Its back legs brushed the tip of her wide-brimmed hat, caught a draft, and swept back toward her like a giant leaf in the wind. Four sets of white eyes alongside its orange head fixed on Melinda as it came back around. She sucked in a breath and fired her pistol again, praying the wind wouldn't shift. The bullet tore through the insect's shell, ripping open its soft insides. Its chitin shattered like it was made of fine china. Bright green goo splattered on the cacti and rocks around her. "These bugs ain't joking," Lance huffed as he crouched next to Melinda, his brown hat askew. The grooves along his mouth deepened as he rooted in his knapsack for a weapon, the blondish stubble on his chin dark with dust. Never seen this many air scorpions before in one place, except in pictures. Looks like their guts will sting something awful. "Poisonous, no doubt," Melinda said. "Aunt Beatrice sure would love a sample. Bullets?" "Almost out," Lance said, and hoisted his rifle. "Bombs?" she asked. "Just the one," Lance said, as they both peered over the edge of the hill at the sharp drop leading to the mine. Hundreds of the orange and beige insects scuttled out of the mine entrance, agitated, it seemed, by Melinda and Lance's presence. The gash in the side of the hill was flanked by a steep rise in the earth around it, creating a bowl into which the scorpions poured. One of the creatures lifted its webbed legs to catch a gust of wind blowing toward them. Before it could take flight, Lance's shot rang out, exploding the bug into green goo. The rest of the scorpions in the pile chittered and clanked their pincers. Though they'd seen plenty of odd creatures in their line of work, this sound was one Melinda was sure would haunt her dreams. "We shouldn't have used all the bombs up in Old Rivers," Melinda said, and tucked a strand of hair back into her hat as Lance passed her the tacky bomb, one of Abel's inventions. "It did a pretty good number on those fire cattle, though," Lance said. "Splattered their guts like fireworks. Want me to toss?" "Who has better aim?" Melinda responded. Lance chuckled and handed her the air-pressured blaster in the shape of a clunky gun. She set about the tedious process of loading it with the tacky bomb, a trap of hammered metal housing a custom explosive. Hooves thundered behind them. The local sheriff who had summoned them, named Gatsum or Gary or something like that, Melinda couldn't remember which, scrambled off his horse. He stared aghast at the mine, his badge flashing like a beacon in the morning sun. "What do we do?" the sheriff shouted, his eyes wide as his Mustang spots. He peered at the pit. "Lord help us. We got to evacuate. We're ruined. I told that Carson not to blow a hole in this godforsaken land. Couldn't wait for his hermit of an uncle to die so he could start mining." "Easy, partner," Lance said. "We've dealt with bigger bads than this before, believe it or not. Any bug can be squashed, and we're the ones to do it." "What do they want?" the sheriff said and wiped his forehead before replacing his hat. "Sometimes critters get it in their heads to look for greener pastures," Lance said. "So they wander out from the edge." "We don't know much about that here," the sheriff sniffed. Melinda understood. Some folks didn't want to say the edge out loud from superstition. They did the best they could to ignore the no man's land of monsters nestled in the northern mountains. Even so, plenty of creatures swarmed out from the edge, taking up residence in the pockets of hills or lakes, or wherever they could find food, but never this far south. "First time we've seen critters this big, way out in the dustlands," Melinda said. "You got any idea why they ventured so far, or how?" "Something disturbed them, maybe," Lance mused. "Don't matter none. We'll teach them," the sheriff huffed. He reached towards his saddle and yanked out a mallet nearly the size of the horse's leg. "Mighty fine looking hammer, but I wouldn't do that," Lance said. "Their blood's got a sting." The sheriff moaned. "They're coming out." Melinda turned her sights back on the pit of squirming scorpions, more of which poured out of the entrance. She breathed, and the tiny muscles around her eyes relaxed. She fired the blaster, sending the tacky bomb soaring through the air. It stuck along the top of the wooden frame of the mining entrance. She pulled out her rifle and steadied, putting the explosive in her sights. The mix of Abel's unique concoction of compressed gunpowder cake and one of his experimental potions would make the tacky bomb consume everything, natural or unnatural, in its path. "So long, suckers," she thought. "You picked the wrong place to nest." "Hurry," the sheriff said as a fresh wave of scorpions crawled out of the mining entrance. A few lifted themselves up as the wind picked up again. "What are you waiting for?" he shouted. "One thing," Melinda said. "Got our payment?" But they're about to swarm," the sheriff sputtered. "Let's see it," she said without moving. "What in Lord's name is she waiting for?" the sheriff shouted. "I'll do it myself." Lance spat out a small glob of tobacco. "Most people can't make that shot there," he said. "I'd be surprised if I could." Okay, your money's right here," the sheriff said, and pulled out the envelope wrapped in twine. Melinda waited until she heard Lance rip it open and the sound of his satisfied breath. She took the shot. The pit went up in a fireball, as lovely a one as she had ever seen, painting the early desert sky reds and oranges against the crystal hard blue. The trio clapped their hands to their ears as the explosion shook the ground and the wooden frame around the cave entrance crashed down. "You make all your clients sweat like this?" the sheriff demanded, taking out a handkerchief to wipe his forehead under his hat. "We try not to take jobs without paying up front," Lance said, tucking the envelope inside his duster. "Keeps us from making any business mistakes." "Some folks will try to stiff us after a job," Melinda added. The sheriff turned red and she tried not to laugh, the adrenaline from the explosion still racing through her veins. "Who's going to clean this up?" The sheriff surveyed the shattered bugs and green gore that stretched out below them. A few bodies in the pile of guts twitched. Lance scooped up a tiny bit of scorpion blood from a severed pincer into a vial. The sheriff knelt to examine it. "Don't touch it," Lance capped the vial. "In our experience, things like this can have a nasty bite, even after death." Melinda set to wiping the guns as Lance and the sheriff exchanged idle chatter. Lance liked to make friends wherever they went, and a moment later, the two men shared a flask. While they talked, something caught Melinda's eye at the entrance of the mine, among the bug guts and fluttering legs. A little flash, like a piece of gold. She grabbed a gunpowder stick and a handful of bullets from their bag. "Be right back," she said, and started to climb the few feet down to the pit. Lance glanced over. "See something?" "Maybe nothing," she replied. Lance resumed his talk with the sheriff, but Melinda knew he'd have one ear and eye on her should anything arise. That was what made them good at what they did, and good together. They never let their guard down and always had each other's backs. It was why Abel loaned them his one-of-a-kind devices and trusted them to bring back samples to study. She unhooked one of those custom devices now, a magnetic heat tracker infused with the blood of a rare gold-heart hummingbird. Magnets, clustered in tiny blobs on the glass, indicated the bodies around her and were packaged neatly into an old pocket watch case. It showed two blobs behind her for Lance and the sheriff, and one smaller blob directly ahead. The material behind the glass, cracked from when Lance had dropped it during an encounter with a mutant cougar, flashed from gray to white. "Never seen that before," Melinda muttered to herself. Something was still in the mine. Okay, I think that's the 10-minute mark.
Thank you for sharing that excerpt with us, Casey. At this point, we're going to move into the interview segment. If anyone in the audience has questions, please do feel free to drop them in the chat, and we'll try to get to them all. So if you could tell us a little bit about your process, challenges, difficulties, and fun in world building of this really wonderful mix of Western fantasy, horror, and post-apocalyptic settings.
Yeah, sure. So Westerns are interesting because you have a lot of the history in addition to your other kind of fantasy, sci-fi elements. And for this particular one, I was inspired by a game, actually a card game called Doomtown, which is based on the Deadlands universe, which is kind of a weird Western world. And I started playing that card game, and that got me into this idea of Westerns being really fun places to explore kind of monsters and ghosts and all these speculative items. So then I thought, I want to write my own weird Western. And mine is basically a parallel world, right? So let me back up. It's basically what would happen if monsters poured into the southwest region of the United States before colonization. So kind of interrupting that part of history. So for this world, I didn't want to use specific cities or historical events, no civil war. It's really kind of a parallel world in a sense. So that was both good and bad in terms of world building. Good in terms of I didn't have to stick to a lot of history per se, but then more challenging in that I had to kind of build my own world more thoroughly than you would otherwise. So to me, that was really fun. And I did draw on historical aspects. I really liked researching, what did people use for toothpaste or kind of these random day-to-day things that I don't know, you don't really know when you think about it, right? So I have details like that throughout the piece. And then the monsters were the other kind of big piece of world building I focused on. And to me, that was really fun to kind of take inspiration from nature and insects and kind of these weird animals and mix and match them a bit. And I started actually doing a monster almanac for myself to track kind of all the monsters and what they're doing. And I have short stories in this world that I had written before the book. So there's some monsters in there. So the almanac kind of helps me track all that. And it's sort of a key part of the world building.
So when it comes to monsters, do you lean into your own fears for this, or common phobias? Where do you begin when you're building your monsters?
So for this one, I did start with my own kind of arachnophobia that I had growing up, and you'll see it on the cover. There's spiders, and these are kind of really hard to defeat, kind of ghost psychic spiders, right? Growing up, I had a very intense fear of spiders that I eventually outgrew. But I think when it comes to horror, sometimes we tap into what our initial fears or kind of primal fears are. So there's actually a lot of insect monsters in this one. And in retrospect, I realized, okay, that was because that's my own personal fear. So for the second book I'm working on, I'm planning to do more mammal-based monsters, and then hopefully the third book will be more aquatic-based monsters. So to balance it out in the animal world.
Well, the scorpions hit close to home for me because they're a frequent visitor to my backyard and occasionally my living room. So I'm thinking, oh God, flying scorpions, no. So, even though probably the greatest shootist of all time was a woman, why do you think we see so few women gunslingers in media? And what inspired you to want to make your gunslinger hero Melinda?
Yeah. So when I started kind of researching Western stories, I actually found a lot of cool tales about women and underrepresented groups. There was a lot of people in the Old West who were LGBT, Black, Asian, kind of all of the nationalities, and a lot of women as well. And they were doing all kinds of things. So, for example, there was obviously Annie Oakley. There was her competitor, Lillian Smith. There were, I love this story. There were two women in Oklahoma at the end of the 1800s who became deputy marshals. And I was reading some of the original newspapers reporting on that. And the newspapers were just shocked. They were like, oh, these beautiful women who can, use their guns and keep peace and order. Um, but what struck me was that there are all these stories and they're not really told in popular media that much. And I think part of it is because we have this mythos around the Old West, and it's very focused on the stoic gunslinger, the cowboy, that kind of solo hero, from the Western movies and whatnot. And it's a very powerful image and archetype. And for this book, I wanted to kind of gender swap it a bit. And that's why Melinda, she's the gunslinger, she's kind of stoic. And her partner, Lance, is the foil. Kind of fun and interesting to do. And the other big thing I wanted to do in the book was to have women at least 50% represented kind of in all the different jobs and roles, and not just the brothel worker, which is usually what you see in weird Westerns and a lot of Western movies. So for me, that was just a fun thing to do that I really wanted to do. And I figured, okay, it's a fantasy world, even if it's not completely historically accurate. Some of it is based in history, and that's the world I'm going to make.
Do you think our culture will be willing to change with these ridiculous perceptions of the archetype of cowboy, with books like this? And do you think media will begin to accept this? The more reality of the world.
Right. I think so, only because we're starting to see more of those stories being told. And especially in weird Westerns and Western horrors, there's been a lot of diverse stories coming out, books, novels, comics that feature a range of characters. And that's really refreshing and just kind of fun to see. I think cinema in Hollywood tends to be maybe a little slower in showing those stories, but definitely in kind of the horror indie publishing world and small press, there seems like there's a resurgence of weird Westerns and Western horrors, and that's really exciting. And I think there's been some shows and movies lately that do showcase more diverse characters than we've seen. So I think it is getting there, but it's a little slow.
As usual, it's indies leading the way. Go indies. So how does when your research process differ? Because you write in multiple genres. So how does your research process differ from writing Weird West versus fantasy or science fiction or horror?
Yeah. So Westerns, I definitely try to get. Oh, I want to be accurate for sure, but I try to avoid specific names of things. So, I want to make sure whatever they're using in the weird Westerns is appropriate for the time, even though it's a parallel universe. Um, And sometimes I get lost in reading about, what kinds of foods did they eat or drinks, what's just the day to day, which I find very interesting. I think there's been a lot of emphasis on like weapons of the Old West. So there's a lot out there on weapons, which is fine, but I wanted to see what are the more day-to-day things. So that was part of my research for Westerns. For horror, fantasy, and sci-fi, most of my stories in those genres take place in current times or near future. So not so heavy on research there, except when it comes to sci-fi. I do try to make sure whatever scientific principle I'm using is, accurate, and hopefully there's no big holes in the plot or whatever technology they're using.
So I don't want to necessarily emphasize the firearms because you said it's more interesting the day to day, but did you go
Mhm.
out and try and shoot yourself or visit the deserts? Did you travel around the Southwest at all, or do you focus mostly on book research?
So a little bit of both. I didn't do any firearm shooting only because I couldn't find, like, it would have been fun to do an hour of like old West gun shooting, just to get the feel of it. I used to do horse riding, so I did a little bit of that just to refresh. And I'm in San Diego, so I kind of have the succulent cacti, desert feel around. Um, I would love to do more in-person research, as it were, but it's a little tough right now with, I have two small children and a full-time job, so usually it's more kind of online book research. But I do love going to kind of the old archives, and you can find a lot of them online of the newspapers of the times, and that gives a really great sense of the voice and what people were thinking about. Also use bookstores, especially around Southern California. I find a lot of interesting books that are covering random pieces of history of the Old West. So that's been really useful too.
If you ever want to come out to Joshua Tree for more of that research, got you covered.
For sure.
um, so you also work as a science writer and editor. How has this work affected your writing of fiction?
So I actually trained in science journalism. And when you train in journalism, the challenge is to write as briefly as possible, to get to the point, to not bury the lead. So that training was very helpful in terms of focusing my writing and keeping it, as sharp as possible. I found that very useful when I started to write short stories. And as far as the science aspect of it, I'm pretty careful about research, and I think that is especially helpful with science fiction. Um, but oddly enough, once I did my journalism degree and, immersed in science communications, I actually had a hard time writing longer pieces because it had sort of been trained out of me a little bit. I just wanted to get to the point, write the story. So now I found kind of a good balance where I'm, extending scenes as needed, but keeping the pacing hopefully pretty quick. And that was the case in this story. It moves fairly quickly. I actually had to go back and add some pauses and some moments of rest just so it wouldn't feel too stressful.
And do you find in your science journalism, do you find some of the concepts that you encounter wheeling their way into your science fiction?
Yeah, for sure. Especially when it's kind of interesting random tidbits of news around, maybe another planet or a weird kind of underwater creature. I mean, that those are such good fodder for story ideas, whether it's monsters or settings or, whatever. I think following science news is really helpful for inspiration.
Indeed. I read science news every week, science news magazines, and it's amazing how many ideas come flooding in.
Uh-huh.
So you've written lots of short fiction and published all over the place in wonderful venues. Do you prefer long form or short form? And how do these processes differ for you? Like what's writing a short story look like for you versus an article? And what's it like for you sitting down writing a novel?
Yeah, short stories are really great when you have limited time because you can write it in a weekend or a week. and finish it and kind of have the piece, which is then much easier to edit, to get feedback on, especially with my time constraints right now. Having two small kids, full-time job, it's, I have very, very limited time to write. So being able to write and finish a short story gives you that dopamine boost of, okay, I completed a project. It's something I can then send out into the world. So short stories are great for that, but novels and longer forms are great for immersing in a world, right? So I really enjoy both. I think patience is not my strong suit. So for a novel, I want to get it done in a month, right? But that's not realistic. So I'm trying to be better about being realistic with my expectations. But short stories can be great breaks and palate cleansers too. If I'm really stuck in a longer piece, I might go write a short story. I also love short stories because they let you experiment with voice or characters or a different genre. And it's not a huge commitment. You can sort of try it out, see if you like it. And then a lot of short stories can become longer pieces. And I think that's pretty common for writers where they'll try to write a novelette and it ends up becoming a novel, which is not a bad thing. So yeah, I really enjoy writing both for different reasons. I think the novel is definitely a little more challenging just in terms of it's really a marathon and you have to pace yourself, but also not lose momentum.
You mentioned before that the world that Melinda West takes place in has appeared in some of your short stories. Um, did that make the world building easier for you, or did you find yourself shackled to things you had done in earlier work?
Hmm. It made the world building easier for sure. And also the characters were already kind of fully formed to some degree. So it made writing the draft much easier. But now that I'm on the second book and I'm trying to make some of these pieces fit, there's like much earlier stories that I kind of have to forget and drop out of the canon, so to speak, to make future stuff work. So yeah, there is some feeling shackled a little bit to previous stories because ideally they would all fit together, right? But for the most part, it's been helpful. And I have a lot of side characters that expand out into bigger stories, and that's really fun. Um, yeah, I don't know. I enjoy doing that. And I think someday I'll probably put all those short stories into a collection that's, yeah, just another part of that world.
So you've mentioned your kids a few times, and I wonder if raising children has inspired you to delve into writing children's fiction at all.
Not at the moment. I've started thinking about it, but oddly, when I had my first child 5 years ago, that was when I started to get very serious about my writing. It sort of kicked me into high gear. I think it was maybe panic at mortality or something. I don't know. And also having such limited time made me really focus my time. So it's not what I expected, but it's been a nice outcome. Before that, I struggled a bit with writer's block and different stories. And now I just don't have time for writer's block. So if it starts to hit, I just switch projects and try to make the most of my time.
I imagine the kids, I know I would have been like, wow, mom makes monsters. That's cool. Um, so back to horror a little bit here. Tell us a bit about your involvement and work with the San Diego HWA chapter. What do you all do down there? I know you're co-founder of the chapter. Tell us about that work.
Yeah, I co-founded the chapter when I moved to San Diego. I think it was 2016. And before that, I actually didn't really identify as a horror writer. And I know a lot of my colleagues have had similar experiences. I thought, I'm just a writer or I'm a sci-fi writer. But somehow I heard about the Horror Writers Association, and the closest they have regional chapters. It's an international organization, the largest one that focuses on horror. Authors are part of it, filmmakers, fans, agents, publishers. It's a great organization. And I heard about it, and the closest chapter was in LA, and I didn't want to drive up to LA every month. So I started asking around and found enough people interested, and we started a chapter, and it's been really wonderful. I didn't realize how many horror writers are in San Diego, and we have a very rich literary community. We have great bookstores. So and horror writers are some of the nicest people I've met in writing circles. So once I sort of founded it and connected with people, I just feel like I had found my community in a sense. And there's also wonderful diversity in horror writers in terms of genres. So some people write YA horror, comedy horror, dark fantasy, weird westerns, extreme horror. There's just the full range, and it's inspiring and interesting. So I've really enjoyed that. And the organization itself offers mentorships. We have a yearly conference called StokerCon, and a lot of other perks. So for any horror fans out there or horror writers, I do recommend checking it out.
And since you work within multiple genres, do you find there's any major differences in the community of science fiction and fantasy versus horror, say, or even in the Western community?
I'm not, I think the Western community tends to be more historic Westerns. There's a whole subgenre of horror Westerns, which seems like it's mostly indie horror authors, and that's been picking up quite a bit. There's a lot of crossover with fantasy for sure, dark fantasy, science fiction horror, which is one of my favorite genres. But in terms of community, it's funny because every writing group is a little different, but as I said, I think horror writers are some of the friendliest, and I've heard other people say that as well, which you wouldn't expect, right? You would expect them to be creepy or, I don't know, intimidating, but actually they're like so nice, so supportive, maybe because we, have the cathartic writing of writing scary stuff. I don't know what it is.
It is sort of an interesting dichotomy that some of the most extreme fiction would come from some of the friendliest folks.
Right?
It does make sense, though. So, will there be more Melinda West stories? And what can your readers expect from your Weird West worlds? And then from the audience here, are the second and third book also going to be with Melinda?
Yeah, so Melinda is the protagonist in the second and third books. It's not necessarily a trilogy, so I wrote the first book as a standalone with some like loose threads, but not with a cliffhanger where you have to read, the next book. And I did that because I wanted to be able to write as many in the series as I felt like, because you never know, maybe by book 3, by book 5, maybe you're tired of it. But for all of the books, Melinda is always the protagonist, and Lance is always there as well. And it's kind of like, what is their situation? What is the high stakes scenario that they have to deal with? And in the second one, which I'm in the midst of now, it's focused around creatures that sort of sweep the land and a mysterious illness, kind of drawing on some of the pandemic fears a little bit. So I think that one will be a little more high stakes than the first one. And then the third one, I have a very loose outline, which is mainly focused around pirates and aquatic monsters. So that will be fun, especially because I don't think Melinda knows how to swim. So we'll see what happens there. And then I have several short stories, new short stories coming out with them and some of the side characters. So there's a businesswoman in the first one, Candelaria, who gets her own kind of origin story coming out in an anthology in August. I believe it's August. And then some other side characters and adventures.
That sounds fun. So this is a two-part question here. We see not as much as I would like to see crossover between Western and horror, Western and fantasy, but we see very little crossover between Western and science fiction. I wondered if you could speak to that, maybe why that is, if it's the blend of the past and the future that's difficult to write, why we don't see more of that, and how it's done when it happens. And then also, if you could speak a little bit to magic systems and how you incorporate, deal with, and come up with how the magic works in your books.
Mhm. Yeah, so I think it is tough to do sci-fi in Westerns because typically you do think of sci-fi as being more futuristic. That said, I have seen cool stories that feature, robots and cyborgs kind of in the Old West setting. Um, I do think a lot of people associate it with steampunk to some degree, even though that's a little more Victorian. So I think maybe there's some blurring there that makes it a little harder. But there are movies and stories that are more sci-fi focused, like Cowboys and Aliens is kind of the main one that comes to mind. But yeah, actually, I think it would be fun to see more stories with aliens or other kind of cosmic issues and more of that sci-fi horror genre blended. Yeah, I do think that would be fun. As far as fantasy Westerns, I do see quite a few of those and drawing on magic systems. And for myself, when I write a magic system, I try to keep it fairly simple because I'm not going full fantasy. And the most important thing for any magical system is consistency, and also to try to set it up ahead of time so things don't feel too convenient or out of the blue. There's a whole art form to it, but my approach is to keep it fairly straightforward, and it's a little more in the periphery. So in the first book, there's a demon, there's some magic involved, but I would say it's not kind of front and center.
Cool. So what's next for you? What are you currently working on? You mentioned a second Melinda book. What can we expect from that and when? And what's going on in your short story worlds?
Yeah, so I don't know when the second book will be coming out. I'm still kind of in the early stages of it, but hopefully a year or so. I don't want it to be much longer than that. Ideally next year, but we'll see. As far as other pieces, I have a short story collection. I've just started to shop around, and it's really focused on kind of the uncanny and ordinary people bumping into strange things kind of at the edges of reality. So very cosmic horror focused. So yes, just starting to shop that around. I'd love to have that out fairly soon. And then I'm in the middle of a ghost story novella that takes place at a Cape Cod bed and breakfast. And it's actually based on one of my short stories. And I wanted to do a 3-parter novella for it. So that I'm kind of in the middle of that and hoping to wrap it up soon.
Wonderful. For anyone that hasn't read Melinda West Monster Gunslinger, it is a super fun ride, wonderful characters, great monsters, interesting world. Go out and get yourself a copy. There's a link in the chat where you can get it if you're watching on YouTube. There's a link below the video. Thank you so much, KC, for joining us at Space Cowboy Books this evening. And thank you for a wonderful read.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun. I appreciate it. And thanks everyone who tuned in.
Bye, everybody. Thank you for coming.